Sicily, a lagoon on the western coast, still as glass. In the middle of it sits a tiny island, 40 hectares, about the size of a modest city park. The island is called Motya, and tonight, in the year 397 before our era, it's packed with people. 6-story buildings lean against each other in the dark. Temples crowd the alleyways. A narrow stone causeway connects Motya to the Sicilian mainland, and right now, people are tearing it apart. They're hacking the road to pieces with picks and hammers, because on the horizon, there are thousands of lights, torches. The army of Dionysius of Syracuse, 80,000 soldiers, 200 warships, and for the first time anyone can remember, catapults, machines that can throw stones over a wall. The people of Motya know they're on their own. Reinforcements from Carthage won't come in time. They've cut the road. They've chosen the island. On the walls, in the torchlight, you can just make out a carved symbol. A triangle, 2 outstretched lines, a circle on top, like a stick figure with its arms raised. The sign of Tanit. You see it everywhere, scratched onto bronze razors in the sanctuary, stamped into coins, painted on the anchors of merchant ships. The same symbol on the tools of war and on the burial jars of children. What it meant, exactly, we still don't fully know. Within days, Motya will fall. The men on the walls won't survive. Greeks who had changed sides and fought for Carthage will be put to death on the shore, in plain view of the fleet. The women and children will be sold. The city will never be rebuilt. But something strange happened afterward. The winners, the Greeks, wrote this story down. The losers didn't. And what happened to Motya happened to the whole civilization. Carthage is the only great power of the ancient world that left behind 0 books of its own. No histories, no poems, nothing in its own voice. Every surviving sentence about Carthage was written by someone who hated it. The Greeks called them cheats. The Romans called them child burners. The Bible condemned their rituals. But who were these people, really? Over the next 45 minutes, we'll trace how a small Phoenician harbor town turned into a power that controlled the western half of the Mediterranean Sea. We'll watch Carthage fight the Greeks over Sicily for 300 years, an island both sides believed was theirs by right. We'll go down into the tophets, strange open-air sanctuaries at the hearts of Phoenician cities in the west, where modern diggers found thousands of charred children's bones sealed in clay jars. We'll try to work out what actually happened there. And we'll sit with a question that the sign of Tanit, carved on a razor and pressed into a child's urn, still doesn't answer. To understand how all of this became possible, from the towers of Motya to the sealed urns in the sanctuary, we need to go back 400 years, to the 8th century before our era, to a thin, rocky coast on the edge of what is now Lebanon. One sea snail yields a single drop. The murex, a small, spiny shellfish you could hold between 2 fingers, produces a tiny gland of oily secretion. Squeeze it out, expose it to sunlight, and the liquid turns color. By some estimates, you need around 12,000 of these snails to get 1.5 grams of usable dye. Fabric colored with this stuff cost more per weight than gold. And the shade was never the same twice, sometimes scarlet, sometimes so deep it looked almost black. You couldn't control it. That unpredictability was part of the price. This is the color that would dress the emperors of Assyria, Rome, and Byzantium for over 1,000 years. And the people who made it? The Greeks had a word for them, Phoenikes, the purple ones. We call them the Phoenicians. They didn't call themselves anything of the kind. They had no shared name. A man from Tyre called himself a Tyrian. A woman from Sidon was a Sidonian. A merchant from Byblos was from Byblos, and that was that. Phoenicia wasn't a country. It was a string of independent city-states along a coastline so narrow you could walk across it in a day, squeezed between the sea on one side and cedar-covered mountains on the other. Modern Lebanon, roughly. These cities shared a language, shared their gods, El, Astarte, Baal, Melkart, and shared one thing above all else, a talent for selling things to people who lived far away. Purple dye was the showpiece, but it was far from the only trick. Phoenician sailors were, by most accounts, the first to steer by the stars near the North Pole. The Greeks later called that constellation Phoeniki, the Phoenician, because the Phoenicians had been steering by it for so long that the constellation itself carried their name. And they did something else, something you're using right now without thinking about it. They built the alphabet. 22 letters, each one a single sound. The letter Aleph was an ox head turned on its side. Bet was the floor plan of a house. Simple pictures stripped to bare lines, each standing for the first sound of the thing it showed. From these 22 signs descend the Greek alphabet, the Latin alphabet, Cyrillic, Arabic, Hebrew, and the 26 letters of modern English. Every message on your phone, every road sign you glance at, the words on this screen right now, all of it traces back to a set of scratched marks invented by traders on a narrow strip of coast who needed a fast, cheap way to keep records of who owed what to whom. The letters Jefferson used to sign the Declaration of Independence had traveled through Latin, through Greek, all the way from the docks of Tyre. So these were useful people, and the great empires around them noticed. Assyria, the superpower of the age, wanted metals, copper, tin, silver. The Phoenicians became something like a naval contractor, ships and sailors in exchange for being left more or less alone. But Assyria's appetite didn't shrink, it grew. And satisfying it meant sailing further and further west to Cyprus, then Sardinia, then all the way to Spain. The Phoenicians started planting outposts along the route, not colonies in the way we usually think of colonies. Nobody was conquering anybody. These were rest stops, warehouses with a dock and a small temple, placed wherever the ships needed fresh water or a safe harbor for the night. And so, a chain of settlements spread across the Mediterranean. Gadir, modern Cadiz on Spain's Atlantic coast, became the most distant. It's still inhabited today, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied cities in Western Europe. Panormus became Palermo. Malacca became Malaga. Utica rose on the North African coast near what is now Tunisia. These outposts weren't held together by any army or any king. They were held together by gods. The Temple of Melkart in Gadir, over 3,000 miles from the Phoenician homeland, served as a guarantor of contracts. You swore your oath at the altar. If you broke your word, Melkart would punish you. That was the deal. And every year, in Tyre, and it seems, in the distant colonies too, They burned a giant wooden figure of the god on a raft and set it adrift on the sea. The ritual was called Igersis, the awakening. Same god, same ceremony, from Lebanon to the Atlantic Ocean. Religion held together what politics couldn't. But purple cloth is what kept the whole system running, in financial terms at least. Pliny the Elder, writing centuries later, still marveled at the cost. Fabric dyed in this color cleared the way for the rods and axes of Rome, he wrote. It adorned the triumphal robe, where it was mixed with gold. But, Pliny asked, why such a price? The answer for Pliny was simple. The dye stank. The production involved rotting snails, urine, and days of boiling in open vats. The smell around a Phoenician dye works was, by all accounts, unbearable. Only a king would wear the result, and only a king could afford it. We know something of how the Phoenicians dealt with their powerful neighbors, because one Egyptian record gives us a voice. Around 1075 before our era, an Egyptian priest named Wenamun sailed to Byblos on a mission. Bring back cedar wood for the sacred barge of the god Amun. Egypt expected the wood for free. Egypt had always gotten the wood for free. King Zakarbal of Byblos told him no. My father supplied Egypt, Zakarbal said. My grandfather supplied Egypt, but they were paid. Bring me gold, bring me silver, bring me linen, bring me fish, bring me 30 baskets. Then we'll talk about cedar. It's one of the earliest recorded moments of a smaller power looking a great empire in the eye and saying, pay up. The Phoenicians were nobody's servants. Not anymore. Among dozens of these outposts scattered across the western Mediterranean, one, founded on the Bay of Tunis sometime around 814 to 750 before our era, didn't stand out at first. Population around 30,000. A bigger, older city named Utica already sat nearby. Nobody had any reason to suspect that this little rest stop, a place the Phoenicians called Carthage, the new town, would be challenging the greatest powers on earth within a few centuries. But first, it would need a story about its own birth. And that story starts with a woman who outsmarted a king with nothing but an ox hide and a sharp knife. Tyre, the harbor, roughly the mid-8th century before our era, and a woman named Elissa is loading ships in the dark. Her husband is dead. Her own brother, Pygmalion, had him put to death and seized the throne. She has a small group of loyal followers, priestesses from the temple of Astarte, and several heavy sacks that look, in the dim light, like they're full of gold. They aren't. They're full of sand. As the ships pull away from the dock, Elissa orders the sacks thrown overboard. She does this slowly, in full view of Pygmalion's spies watching from the shore. The message is clear. The treasure is at the bottom of the harbor. No point chasing a woman who just dumped her own fortune into the sea. By the time anyone figures out the trick, Elissa's ships are already past the horizon, heading west. That's the legend, at least. The Romans would later call her Dido, and poets would build entire worlds around her name. But long before Virgil got hold of the story, the Phoenicians themselves were already telling it. And the next part is the one that stuck. Elissa reaches the North African coast. She finds a bay with good water and high ground, and she goes to the local chieftain, a man named Iarbas. She asks him for a piece of land. No bigger, she says, than an ox hide. Iarbas agrees. Why not? An ox hide is a small thing. Elissa takes the hide, stretches it flat, and cuts it into strips so thin they're almost thread. Then she lays the strips end to end in a circle around an entire hill. The hill would later be called Bursa, and on top of it, she begins to build. You can hear the Greeks laughing when they tell this story. This is exactly what they expected from Phoenicians. Clever, slippery, always finding the angle. Ask for a hide, get a hill. But notice something. The Greeks told this story as a warning. The Phoenicians told it with pride. But the legend doesn't end with the trick. It ends badly. Iarbas wants to marry Elissa. The local leaders of the new settlement come to her with a message. Agree, or he'll burn the town to the ground. Elissa has no army, no fleet large enough to fight. She tells the people she needs time to prepare. She builds a great fire in the center of the settlement, a pyre, the kind used for funerals. And then she climbs onto it. I go to my husband, she says. She means the one Pygmalion had put to death back in Tyre. She steps into the flames. The founder is dead. She has no children, no heirs. Nobody in the new city can claim the right to rule by blood. And this detail, legendary or not, explains something real about Carthage. Carthage never had kings. Families that rose to power did it through wealth, not through bloodlines. The richest governed. Money decided who mattered. Now, Dido is mostly a literary figure. Virgil shaped the version most people know. There's no trace of her worship in the ruins of Carthage, no cult, no temple in her name. Historians still argue about how much of the story has any truth to it. But the political fact is real. Carthage was a city run by its richest families from its earliest days. And the Dido legend, true or invented, carries that fact inside it like a seed. What does archaeology actually tell us about the beginning? It tells us that Carthage really was founded by settlers from Tyre. The deepest layers of the site contain standard Phoenician pottery, the red slip kind you find across the homeland. But right next to it, mixed in from the very start, sits Greek pottery, cups, bowls, oil jars. From its first years, Carthage was trading with everybody. The geography helped. A natural crossroads of sea routes, the Bay of Tunis sits where the western and eastern halves of the Mediterranean meet. The Magerda River brought fresh water from the hills. High cliffs on the seaward side made defense easier. It was a good spot for a harbor. But for the first 200 or 300 years, that's all it was. A harbor. A place to fill your water jars and patch your hull before pushing on towards Spain or Sardinia. Nothing that would worry a Greek general or an Assyrian king. And yet, in those earliest layers, the diggers found something odd. Among the Phoenician pottery and the imported Greek cups, there were signs of a goddess almost unknown back in Lebanon. A deity who barely appears in the records of Tyre or Sidon. Her symbol was simple: a triangle for a body, a horizontal line for arms, a circle for a head. Tanit. Where she came from, nobody is certain. Why she took root here, on this coast, so far from the homeland, and why she would grow to overshadow the old gods within a few centuries, remains one of the open questions of Punic history. We'll come back to her. But first, daily life. What did early Carthage look, feel, and smell like? Mud brick houses by the shore. Small, single-story. Nothing like the towers that would come later. The people kept sheep, goats, and pigs. More pigs than you'd expect from Phoenicians, actually. And some scholars think the habit came from Greek neighbors. Breakfast was porridge made from emmer wheat, a tough old grain that grows almost anywhere. The pomegranate was everywhere. The Romans would later call it malum punicum, the Phoenician apple, and the name stuck. Our word pomegranate descends from it. Meat came on feast days, but feast days were frequent. Every time a new settlement was founded, every time a temple was dedicated, the whole community ate together. Roasted lamb, wine poured onto the altar, the fat burned for the gods. The Romans, centuries later, would sneer at the Carthaginians as porridge eaters. The Carthaginians, one suspects, didn't care. The little new town grew quietly on the Bay of Tunis. For 300 years, it served as a dock for ships hauling Spanish silver back to the homeland. But in the 6th century before our era, the world around Carthage changed. The Assyrian and Babylonian empires battered Tyre in turn. Then Persia arrived and swallowed what was left of the Phoenician coast. Waves of refugees poured westward, looking for any city that would take them in. The convenient dock on the Bay of Tunis was suddenly the biggest Phoenician city still standing free. And the harbor town started turning into a capital. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century before our era, listed the 3 best-governed states he knew: Sparta, Crete, and Carthage. A Greek philosopher who spent his entire career treating non-Greeks as natural inferiors just placed a Phoenician city alongside the proudest states in Greece. What did he see? He saw stability. Carthage had almost no civil wars, no coups, no tyrants seizing power in the night. The people seemed content, or at least quiet. And the system that kept them that way was built entirely around money. 2 elected officials ran the state. The Carthaginians called them tophetes, which translates roughly as judges. They served 1-year terms, and the calendar itself was dated by their names, the way Romans would later date years by their consuls. Below them sat the Council of 104, a body of wealthy men who oversaw military commanders and held generals accountable after their campaigns. There was also a popular assembly, open to ordinary citizens, but it was almost never called into session. Citizenship itself covered only about 1 person in 10. The rest, the Libyan farmers and laborers and immigrants, who made up the bulk of the population, had no vote at all. Religious life ran on a separate track, overseen by an office called the Rab Kohanim, the chief of priests. And here Carthage differed from most of its neighbors. Women could hold high religious office. We know this because of a tombstone. The inscription belongs to a woman named Bat Baal. It names her father, a priest, her husband, a tophet, his father, also a tophet, his grandfather and great-grandfather, tophets too. 4 generations of rulers in a single family, and at the center of it, a woman who served as high priestess. Religion, government, and family wealth woven tight together. The Dido legend promised a city where power followed money. Bat Baal's tombstone shows what that actually looked like, carved in stone. So much for politics. What about war? This is where Carthage becomes genuinely strange, because citizens of Carthage didn't fight. The merchants, the ship owners, the members of the great trading families, the people who ran the city and made its laws, they did not pick up weapons. War was something you paid other people to do. When Carthage went to war, it assembled armies from its subjects and its allies. The backbone was Libyans drafted into service, farming people who lived under Carthaginian rule in much the same way that Italian communities lived under Rome. On top of them, Numidian cavalry from the desert hinterland, superb horsemen who rode without saddles. And then, the mercenaries. Balearic slingers from the islands off Spain, famous for their accuracy. Iberian swordsmen, Gauls, Ligurians from the Italian coast, sometimes even Greeks. An army that spoke 5 or 6 languages and had no common culture at all. Polybius, the Greek historian who studied Carthage closely, put the problem bluntly. How can a general address them all at once? How is he supposed to know all their languages? And repeating the same thing through 4 or 5 interpreters is even less practical. The officers were Carthaginian citizens. Everyone else brought borrowed hands and borrowed spears. One detail says more than the rest. The very first coins Carthage ever minted were not trade currency. They were stamped with a single word: camp, military pay. The first money the city produced existed for one purpose only: to keep the soldiers from leaving. The entire war machine ran on cash. As long as the treasury held, it worked. When the money dried up, the machine would break apart, and badly. One caveat, though. Polybius had his own reasons for painting Carthaginian armies as chaotic mobs of hired foreigners. He was promoting the idea that citizen militias, like Rome's, were naturally better. He wasn't wrong about the multi-ethnic makeup, but he was making an argument, not writing a balanced report. That's worth keeping in mind whenever we listen to ancient sources talk about Carthage. The facts are real. The framing is someone else's. If the setup sounds familiar, professional soldiers fighting for pay, directed by a civilian government that keeps its own hands clean, it should. This was the ancient version of outsourced war. The system worked for centuries. Its weakness was always the same. Loyalty you purchase lasts exactly as long as the purchase. The hired army needed money, and money came from trade. Carthage sat at the crossroads of 2 great shipping routes, one running east to west from Spain to the Phoenician homeland, and the other running north to south from Sardinia up to the Etruscan ports of Italy. Control the crossroads, and you control the flow. The Carthaginian approach wasn't conquest, it was leverage. We won't take your city, but if you want to trade in this part of the sea, you trade through us. The fleet served double duty, carrying cargo in peacetime and fighting in war. And the harbor that held it was unlike anything else on the Mediterranean. The Kothon, a man-made circular basin carved into the coast, designed to hold 220 warships, an island sat at its center, and on the island, the Admiralty. Ships approaching from the open sea couldn't see inside. The harbor was hidden until you were already in it. Carthage didn't conquer the other Phoenician cities. It formed alliances with Utica and Gadir, letting them keep their own governments. But it planted new settlements right next to them, pulling trade routes toward itself. Soft control, the hand in the velvet glove. What did all this wealth look like inside the house? You entered through a bath. Before you set foot in the home itself, you washed. The outside world was unclean. The interior was a kind of sacred ground. Floors were covered in mosaics, tiny colored stones pressed into patterns. Some scholars believe the Carthaginians may have invented this technique, long before it became a standard feature of Roman villas. The wine was strong and sweet, and by reputation, hit like nothing you'd tasted before. A Carthaginian named Mago wrote an agricultural treatise that the Romans valued so highly they had it translated after the city's fall. One of its surviving passages is a recipe. Pick well-ripened early grapes. Discard any that are moldy or damaged. Spread them on reeds in the sun. Cover them at night against the dew. A careful, precise man, writing about grapes, in a city that would one day be burned to the ground. Aristotle admired all of this: the stability, the efficiency, the absence of violent upheaval. But he added a warning. Public offices in Carthage could be bought, and when any position in government can go to the highest bidder, he wrote, the state begins serving wealth instead of talent. It was a quiet flaw, easy to overlook in good times. In bad times, it would eat the city from the inside. A city run by its richest traders, a hired army, government posts for sale. All of it running smoothly while the silver kept flowing from Spain and the trade routes stayed open. But Aristotle, for all his admiration, didn't mention one more thing that made Carthage different from every other city on the Mediterranean. At the very center of town, inside the fortified walls, there was a place that was not a cemetery and not a temple. Something else, something in between. 20th century archaeologists would give it a name: the tophet. And what they found there still unsettles scholars today. If you're finding this interesting, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button. It makes a genuine difference in helping this kind of content reach more people. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a great time. Here's a question for you. The Carthaginians never sent their own citizens to fight. They hired mercenaries from across the Mediterranean instead. Would you trust your country's safety to an army that fights for money, not loyalty? Drop your answer in the comments. Carthage, the 1920s. French archaeologists are digging in the center of the ancient city, near the old harbor. They uncover an open area, roughly the size of a village square. Beneath rows of upright stone markers, they find urns, clay jars sealed shut, thousands of them. Inside, charred bones, small bones, the bones of children. By the time the excavation is done, more than 20,000 urns will come out of the ground at this single site. The archaeologists called the place a tophet, borrowing a word from the Hebrew Bible. And from the moment the first jars were opened, the same question has hung over every study, every paper, every argument. What happened here? Start with what the Greeks and Romans said. They had no doubts. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century of our era, described it plainly. Wealthy Carthaginian families, he wrote, would purchase infants from the poor and offer them in place of their own children. The mother who sold her child was forbidden from weeping. If she wept, she lost the payment. The sound of flutes and drums filled the air during the ceremony, so that the cries of the infant wouldn't carry. Clitarchus, an earlier Greek writer, described a bronze figure with outstretched arms, a fire lit beneath it. The child was placed on the arms and slid down into the heat. As the small body contracted, the face seemed to twist into something like a grin. The Greeks called this expression the sardonic smile. Even the Romans, a people who watched men fight to the death in their arenas for entertainment, wrote about the Carthaginian practice with disgust. That's the picture the ancient world left us. For a long time, Modern historians accepted it at face value. Then, in the 20th century, the pushback began. The skeptics made strong arguments. Infant death in the ancient world was common beyond anything we can easily imagine today. Fewer than half of all children born survived past the age of 10. A place filled with the cremated remains of babies didn't need a sinister explanation. It could simply be a cemetery for children who died before their time, of fever, of hunger, of any one of 100 causes that modern medicine has since conquered. And every written source was hostile. Plutarch was Greek, Clitarchus was Greek. The Romans had their own reasons to paint Carthage in the worst possible light. Nothing like child sacrifice had ever turned up in Phoenicia proper, back in Lebanon, where the same gods were worshipped. A study published in 2010 by a team led by Smith examined the remains and concluded the age patterns were consistent with natural infant death. Case closed? Not quite. The last 30 years have made things harder, not easier. Tophets have appeared at dozens of Punic sites across the Western Mediterranean, from Sicily to Sardinia to North Africa. And the children in these urns are not all newborns. Some were 3 years old, some 4, some 5. When researchers examined teeth from the Motya remains, they found no signs of disease. DNA testing turned up something else. Paired burials of relatives. 2 children from the same family sealed in a single jar. And then there are the inscriptions. On the stone markers above the urns, in scratched Phoenician letters, the same formula appears again and again. It translates roughly as, "I bring this offering to my beloved Baal Hamon, because he fulfilled his end of the bargain, and now I must fulfill mine." This is the language of a contract. A deal between a person and a god, and the person is paying what was promised. But not every urn holds a child. Some contain only the bones of a lamb, and some hold a child and a lamb together in the same jar. The Punic word for this kind of offering, mulk, was misread for centuries. Later tradition turned it into Moloch, a terrifying god who devoured children. In fact, Malk means gift or offering. It's the name of the ritual, not a deity. So where does the evidence actually land? The current view among scholars is uncomfortable because it points in 2 directions at once. Some of the children in the tophets almost certainly died of natural causes and were buried in a sacred place, a kind of sacred ground reserved for the very young. But others were offerings, and the proportion of offerings appears to have grown over the centuries. At the height of Carthaginian power, the practice was at its peak. From the 4th century before our era onward, a new formula starts appearing on the markers. "Look, O God, I bring my own flesh." Apparently, by then, too many people had been gaming the system, purchasing someone else's child and presenting it as their own. The new words were a correction, a declaration that this time the offering was real. And at the center of all of this stands Tanit. Her sign, the triangle with outstretched lines and a circle for a head, appears on roughly every second stone marker in the tophet. But the same sign is also scratched onto bronze ritual razors, stamped into the anchors of merchant ships, painted on the walls of private houses. Tanit doesn't show up anywhere in Carthage before the 5th century before our era. And then, almost overnight, she rises. Within a few generations, she overtakes Baal Hamon, the old chief god, and is listed first in inscriptions. She's called the face of Baal, goddess of fertility, goddess of war, protector of the city. The same deity on the instrument of a ritual offering and on the charm above your front door. Where did she come from? The traces in the Phoenician homeland are almost zero. Her rise in Carthage is so sudden that some scholars believe she's a fusion, a blend of the Phoenician Astarte with local North African cults. Others disagree. The honest answer is, we don't know for certain. And some things remain unexplained even after decades of work. Why a child and a lamb in the same jar? Why paired burials of relatives? And why, on a detailed price list for temple sacrifices found at a Punic site near modern Marseille, are children not mentioned at all? That price list is worth pausing over. It's called the Marseille Tariff, and it's one of the most practical documents to survive from the Punic world. 1 bull, 10 shekels to the priest, plus a specific cut of the meat, plus all the ribs. A lamb costs less. If the priest overcharges, he pays a fine. If the worshipper underpays, he pays a fine. If the animal comes from your own herd, you keep what's left after the god's portion is burned. Everything is accounted for. And in all of these careful, detailed rules, children are nowhere. One inscription, though, does survive from a father. Bomilcar, son of Hanno, grandson of Milky Aton, dedicates his firstborn son. May your blessing come upon him. No explanation, no apology. A man who carved what he did into stone and left it standing in the open air. These are the questions the tophet leaves us with. The answer, if there is one, lies somewhere between a cemetery and an altar, and the line between the two moved, depending on the century and depending on how frightened the city was. We'll see what happened when that fear reached its peak. But while 21st century scholars sit with these urns and argue over what they mean, the Carthaginians themselves were living with something far more immediate. The tophets were real. The rituals were real. And so were the trade routes, the elections, the mercenary contracts. All of it ran at the same time, in the same city, day after day. And outside the city, a problem was growing that no number of offerings could solve. The richest island in the Mediterranean sat 120 miles from the Carthaginian coast. Greeks had been settling there for generations, and neither side was willing to share. 480 before our era. On the eastern side of the Mediterranean, 300 Spartans are making their last stand at Thermopylae. The Greek fleet is breaking the Persians at Salamis. Everybody knows this story. But in that same year, possibly on the very same day as the Greeks themselves loved to claim, a battle every bit as large was being fought on the other side of the sea, and almost nobody has heard of it. Sicily, the biggest island in the Mediterranean. Volcanic ash from Mount Etna had made the soil so rich that grain practically grew itself. For centuries, this island fed half the ancient world. Greek colonies had taken root along the eastern and southern coasts. Syracuse, Gela, Acragas, cities that rivaled Athens in wealth and ambition. On the western tip, the Phoenician settlements, Motya on its tiny island, Panormus, Saguntum. For generations, Greeks and Phoenicians lived side by side, traded with each other, and mostly stayed out of each other's way. But by the 6th century before our era, the good land was gone. Every hillside, every river valley with decent soil had been claimed. New waves of Greek settlers kept arriving, many of them refugees from the Persian wars in the east, and they pressed closer and closer to the Punic towns in the west. Carthage responded by building its first dedicated war fleet. In alliance with the Etruscans, they crushed a Greek naval force in the Sardinian Sea around 535 before our era. When a Spartan prince named Dorius tried to plant a colony on western Sicily, the Carthaginians stopped him. He did not survive the attempt. This was no longer a trade dispute. This was a fight over territory, and it would last for 300 years. The first great collision came at Himera, a Greek city on the north coast of Sicily. A local tyrant named Tyrillus had been thrown out of power, and he turned to Carthage for help. The Carthaginian general Hamilcar, head of the powerful Magonid family, assembled exactly the kind of army Carthage was built to produce: Libyan infantry, Numidian horsemen, Iberian and Gallic mercenaries. Herodotus lists the full roster: Phoenicians, Libyans, Iberians, Ligurians, Elymians, Sardinians, Corsicans. A fighting force pulled from every corner of the western Mediterranean. On the other side stood Gelon, the tyrant of Syracuse, at the head of a Greek alliance. The result was total defeat for Carthage. Hamilcar's army was destroyed. The general himself did not survive the day. One account says he threw himself into the sacrificial fire that was burning on the battlefield. Another says he fell in the fighting. Either way, the loss was complete. The Greek historians left one thing out. Recent excavations of Himera's western cemetery, where the defenders of the city were buried, turned up something the ancient sources never mentioned. DNA analysis, published in a major study in 2022, showed that roughly a third of the fighters buried on the Greek side weren't local at all. They had been recruited from distant parts of the Mediterranean. The Greeks, who built their entire identity on the idea of citizen soldiers fighting for their own homeland, were quietly hiring outsiders too. Their historians simply didn't mention it. The result of Himera was 70 years of silence. Carthage pulled back from Sicily entirely. No raids, no campaigns, no involvement in Sicilian affairs. 70 years. And then a grandson came looking for his grandfather's grave. By the last years of the 5th century before our era, Carthage had recovered. The population was growing, the fleet was rebuilt, new coins were being minted. In 409 before our era, Hannibal Mago, grandson of the Hamilcar who had been destroyed at Himera, landed on Sicily with a fresh army. He marched to Himera. Diodorus, the Greek historian, describes what happened next. Hannibal Mago took the city, captured 3,000 of its defenders, and put them to death at the exact place where his grandfather had fallen. Then he leveled the city. Himera, the site of Carthage's greatest humiliation, ceased to exist. Revenge, in this family, was patient and thorough. What followed was decades of war across the island, Greek against Carthaginian, city against city. And then, in 398 before our era, a Greek tyrant changed the rules. Dionysius I of Syracuse built a new kind of war machine. Catapults that could hurl stones over a city wall, and quinqueremes, warships with 5 banks of oars, faster and heavier than anything the Mediterranean had seen. He aimed all of it at Motya. And here we are, back where we started. The tiny island in the lagoon, its causeway torn apart, the people cut off on all sides. Dionysius floated siege towers on rafts across the shallow water. The defenders of Motya fought from the rooftops of their 6-story buildings, floor by floor. It didn't matter. The city fell. The men who survived the siege did not survive what came after. Greeks who had switched sides and fought for Carthage were put to death on the shore in view of the fleet. The women and children were sold. Motya was never rebuilt. In its place, Carthage would later found a new city on the western tip of Sicily, Lilybaeum. But Motya left behind one archaeological detail that says more than any battle account. When the defensive wall was built around the island in the 6th century, the builders were in a hurry. The wall cut straight through the regular cemetery where the ordinary dead were buried. Graves were smashed, headstones knocked aside. The builders didn't stop. But the tophet, which sat in a different part of the island, was outside the wall. It stood beyond the defensive perimeter, unprotected by the fortifications, and yet untouched. The wall went through the cemetery without a second thought. The tophet, it went around. This tells us something the texts don't. Whatever the tophet was, it wasn't just another burial ground. It had a standing of its own, a status that even military engineers in a rush wouldn't violate. A place set apart from the rest of the city and from the rest of the dead. And the mercenary army that fought at Himera, that marched back to Himera 70 years later, that defended Motya and lost? This was the system working as designed. A patchwork force, speaking half a dozen languages, held together by pay. Polybius would later ask, how can a general address them all at once? The answer was, he couldn't. But as long as the money flowed, it didn't matter. The soldiers didn't need to love the cause. They needed to be paid. The weakness was always the same. After the First Punic War with Rome, decades later, the treasury would finally run dry. 20,000 unpaid mercenaries would turn on their employers and nearly destroy Carthage from within. The purchased army, when the purchase stopped, became the threat. But that was still in the future. For now, picture the scene from Carthage itself. Motya was destroyed, Himera leveled, and decades of warfare had scarred the island from coast to coast. And the citizens of Carthage? They were at home, going about their lives. They didn't fight, remember? While hired soldiers fell on Sicilian battlefields, life in the capital went on. New houses rose along the harbor. Merchant ships came and went with the tides, and offerings were burned in the tophets. War was something that happened far away, over the horizon, to other people. It had been that way for 300 years. Carthage was a city that bought its wars and shipped them somewhere else, safely distant from its own streets. What happens to a city like that when the war comes home? Carthage, around 315 before our era. The city at the summit of its power, 300,000 people. Limestone houses rising 6 stories above the streets, their floors covered in mosaics. Markets heaped with Spanish silver, Greek pottery, African gold, elephant ivory. 220 warships sitting in the hidden harbor. In the smaller Punic towns west of the capital, people kept Barbary macaques as household pets, and according to Diodorus, harming one of these monkeys was punishable by death. Carthaginians exported them across the sea. Their skulls have turned up in digs as far away as Egypt and Ireland. The temples of Baal Haman and Tanit overflowed with offerings, And not once in the entire recorded history of this city had its own citizens been called to fight. Why would they? That was what the mercenaries were for. War was a service you bought, like any other, and it happened somewhere else. Then a potter's son crossed the sea. Agathocles came from Syracuse. His father made clay pots. Agathocles made himself a general, then a tyrant, seizing power in a military coup in 317 before our era. He minted coins with his own face, stamped in the style of Alexander the Great. He had ambition far bigger than Syracuse, and Carthage noticed too late. When Carthaginian forces crushed his army in Sicily and laid siege to Syracuse, Agathocles did the one thing nobody expected. He broke through the blockade with a small fleet, crossed the open sea, and landed on the African coast. His goal was simple. If Carthage wanted to fight in Sicily, he would bring the war to Carthage. Justin, the Roman historian, records what Agathocles told his soldiers on the beach. He ordered his own ships burned. There would be no retreat. They would win, or they would stay in Africa forever. Carthage was not ready. It had never been ready for this. The mercenary army, every hired soldier the city could pay for, was across the sea in Sicily, besieging Syracuse. The capital itself was almost empty of fighting men. For the first time in all of recorded history, an enemy stood at the walls, and there was no one to meet him. Citizens who had never touched a weapon in their lives were handed spears and shields. Merchants, traders, dock workers, men who had spent their careers buying and selling, were marched out to face Greek veterans who had been fighting since they were old enough to carry a sword. The result was what you'd expect. They were routed. In the captured Carthaginian camp, Agathocles' soldiers found something that tells you everything about how Carthage understood war. 20,000 sets of shackles. The Carthaginians had packed them before the campaign, certain they would be taking Greek prisoners home in chains. They had planned for victory the way they planned for a business deal. Supplies ready, logistics sorted. It never occurred to them that they might be the ones in chains. Diodorus describes what happened inside the city walls. Panic and great confusion seized the city. The crowd rushed to the public square. The council of elders deliberated what to do. There was no army that could take the field against the enemy. The mass of citizens, who had no experience in war, had already given way to despair. And in that despair they turned to the last resort. The Carthaginians concluded, according to Diodorus, that the gods were angry. The reason? They had been cheating. For years, wealthy families had been buying other people's children and offering them in place of their own. The gods noticed. And now the gods were punishing the city. Diodorus writes that 200 children from the noblest families were offered publicly. Another 300 adults came forward on their own. One source, one hostile Greek author, one account that may well have inflated the numbers. We should say that plainly. But the mechanism itself, the turn to mass offering in a moment of absolute crisis, fits everything the archaeology has been showing us. The inscriptions in the tophets that read, "He fulfilled his end of the bargain, and now I must fulfill mine." The steady growth of offerings through the 4th and 3rd centuries. The shift from substitute children to the formula, "I bring my own flesh." This is what the institution had been building toward. In peacetime, the tophets operated quietly. Most of the urns held infants who had died of natural causes, buried in sacred ground. But in a moment of mortal danger, the line between the cemetery and the altar moved, and it moved sharply. A city that had always purchased other people's lives for its wars, when the system cracked, paid with its own. The numbers may be wrong. Diodorus may have doubled or tripled them. But the logic is what matters. The cost, when it finally came due, was not measured in silver. Agathocles never took the city. The triple walls of Carthage held. After several years of fighting in Africa, his campaign fell apart. He sailed back to Sicily, and peace was signed. Life returned to its old rhythms. But Agathocles had proved something that couldn't be unproved. Carthage was reachable. The walls could be threatened. A city that sent its wars overseas could have war delivered to its door. All it took was one commander with enough nerve to cross the water and burn his own ships. Half a century later, Rome would take that lesson and run with it. But that is another story, and we won't be telling it today. What interests us now is a different question. Carthage was, in the end, destroyed, burned, leveled, scraped from the earth so completely that, according to a later tradition, the Romans plowed salt into the ground where it had stood. Most historians now doubt this happened, but the image tells you how total the destruction was. Its libraries were handed off to allied kings or lost to fire. Its histories, its poetry, its navigational charts, its medical texts, all of it vanished. What, if anything, is left? 1971. The coast of western Sicily near the town of Marsala. Archaeologists working on a wreck pull up the remains of an ancient ship from the seafloor. The hull is in pieces, but the pieces are covered in markings. Scratched into every plank in Phoenician letters, Aleph to Aleph, Bet to Bet. Match the letters, fit the parts together. These aren't inscriptions or prayers. They're assembly instructions. The ship was a flat-pack kit designed to be put together by anyone who could read the labels. 3,000 years before anyone thought to put an Allen key in the box. The Marsala ship was probably sunk at the Battle of the Agathocles Islands in 241 before our era, the battle that ended the First Punic War. And what the wreck revealed amazed the people who studied it. The Phoenicians had invented serial production of warships from standardized parts. Every beam, every rib, every plank was labeled so that anyone with the instructions could assemble a hull. Lose a ship in battle, and its replacement was ready within days. When the Romans captured one of these vessels, they were so impressed that they copied the design. The Roman fleet that would eventually crush Carthage was built on Carthaginian engineering. But copying a ship turned out to be much easier than copying a civilization. In 146 before our era, Roman soldiers entered Carthage for the last time. What they destroyed is almost impossible to measure. The libraries of Carthage, which may have contained centuries of written history, poetry, navigational charts, medical knowledge, were partly burned and partly handed over to Rome's Numidian allies. Not a single literary text written by a Carthaginian survived to the present day. The only fragments we have are things the Greeks and Romans thought useful enough to translate. Scraps of Mago's agricultural treatise, the same careful man who wrote instructions for drying grapes in the sun. And the travel journal of Hanno the Navigator, a Carthaginian admiral who sailed down the west coast of Africa, possibly as far as modern Cameroon. Hanno encountered large, hairy creatures in the forests near the coast and brought their skins back to Carthage. According to Pliny, those skins hung in the temple of Tanit until the city was destroyed. Centuries later, when European naturalists needed a name for the great apes they found in the same West African forests, they borrowed Hanno's word, gorillas. Everything else is gone. This is why every sentence of Carthage's history is told in the voices of people who wanted it erased. And yet, things survived. They survived in ways the Romans couldn't prevent, because by the time Rome burned the archives, these things were already woven too deeply into the world to be pulled out. Those same 22 letters that Phoenician traders once scratched on cargo lists became the Greek alphabet, became the Latin alphabet, became the letters on your screen right now. Cyrillic, Arabic, Hebrew, they all descend from the same root. And the gods didn't die either. Baal Hamon, the old chief god of the tophets, became the Roman Saturn. The Romans told a story about Saturn devouring his own children. Whether that myth absorbed the memory of what happened in the tophets is something scholars still argue over. Tanit became Juno Celestis, the heavenly Juno. But under her Roman name, she kept her Punic character. Bilingual inscriptions carved in both Latin and Phoenician keep turning up across North Africa for hundreds of years after the fall of Carthage. The Punic language refused to disappear. The Severan dynasty, Roman emperors of the 2nd and 3rd centuries of our era, came from Leptis Magna, a city that had once been Punic. Behind their backs, Roman aristocrats mocked them for being so well educated that they spoke without a Punic accent. The joke tells you two things: that Punic was still being spoken 3 centuries after Carthage's fall, and that speaking it was considered embarrassing. Emperor Caracalla went further than any of them. He restored Hannibal's tomb in Asia Minor and made pilgrimages to it. The conqueror's descendant honoring the conquered general. And the sign of Tanit? The triangle with outstretched arms? Archaeologists find it on Sardinia, on Malta, on Ibiza, in Morocco. Carved into stone, pressed into clay, painted on walls. A goddess that Rome tried to absorb, but couldn't quite erase. Thomas Jefferson, who built his political thinking on the model of Republican Rome, inherited Rome's contempt along with its ideals. He called the British modern Carthaginians, merchant-minded, faithless, corrupted by commerce. Punica fides, Punic faith, was the old Roman phrase for treachery, and Jefferson used it without irony. Jefferson never paused to notice. The letters he used to write that insult, the script on the page, the shapes his pen made, descended through Latin, through Greek, from those same Phoenician traders he was calling faithless. The alphabet of the cheats became the alphabet of the Republic that claimed to despise them. A civilization that gave the world the building blocks of written language couldn't use those blocks to save itself. Everything Carthage wrote was burned or scattered. But the letters outlived the libraries, outlived the city, outlived Rome itself. One coin tells this story in miniature. A Barcid-era piece from the 3rd century before our era. On one side, the face of Melkart, the old Phoenician god, drawn to look like the Greek Heracles. On the other side, an elephant. Minted in Spain from high-purity Iberian silver. Meanwhile, the coins being struck in Carthage itself were already mixed with cheaper metals. 23 years of war with Rome had drained the treasury. That inflation is exactly what set off the mercenary revolt that nearly tore the city apart. Even in a coin, you can read the story of a civilization running out of time. And then there's the philosopher. His Punic name was Hasdrubal. He left Carthage for Athens 17 years before the end, and in Athens he took the name Clitomachus. He studied at the New Academy, the philosophical school that traced its roots back to Plato. When news reached him in 146 before our era that his home city had been destroyed, that its people were being sold on Roman markets, he was still a student. He wrote a work of consolation for his countrymen, arguing that even in the ruin of one's homeland, a wise person could find comfort in philosophy. Decades later, he would rise to lead the academy itself. It's hard to say what comforted the survivors more, his philosophy or their new master's chains. So how did a merchant city with no standing army hold half the Mediterranean for nearly 300 years? With a checkbook. Carthage bought other people's armies, other people's hands, other people's spears. It built a system where war was a service, like shipping or banking, and it could be purchased on the open market. The system ran for centuries. It ran smoothly, profitably, and at a safe distance from the city's own walls. Until Agathocles crossed the sea and proved that the walls were reachable. That a city of merchants who had never held a weapon could be brought to its knees by anyone bold enough to show up. 50 years later, Rome would take that lesson to its conclusion. But that is another story. Carthage's voice isn't silent because it had nothing to say. It's silent because the winners burned everything it said. Back to Motya, the tiny island in the lagoon, 40 hectares, where we began. Today, it's an open-air museum. Tourists walk among the foundations of buildings that once rose 6 stories high. They peer into the Kothon, the little harbor carved from the rock, a miniature version of the great military port at Carthage. The tophet is open to visitors. Stone markers bearing the sign of Tanit stand in the same spots they've occupied for 2,700 years. The lagoon is still. The causeway was never rebuilt. Far to the south, on the other side of the sea, in a suburb of modern Tunis, there's a round pond. That's all that remains of the Kothon, the harbor that once held 220 warships, with its Admiralty Island at the center and its entrance hidden from the open sea. Nearby sits the hill of Byrsa, the one where Alyssa supposedly stretched her ox hide. On top of it now stands the Cathedral of St. Louis. Beneath the soil of Tunis, under Roman mosaics, under the foundations of Arab houses, layers of Carthaginian life still lie buried. Red Phoenician pottery, charred grains of wheat, grimacing clay masks that were meant to ward off evil spirits, and the sign of Tanit, triangle, line, circle, a woman with outstretched arms. The same sign on a ritual razor and on a child's urn. When Augustine of Hippo asked North African peasants around the year 400 of our era who they were, they answered with one word: Chanani. We are Canaanites. 550 years after Rome had ground their capital to dust. 550 years, and they still remembered. Then other Semitic peoples came, the Arabs, and the language of the Canaanites finally fell quiet. But the letters, those same 22 signs that Phoenician sailors scratched onto the planks of their ships, are still alive. In every word you're reading, in every message you send. Carthage is silent, but its alphabet speaks for the world. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this journey through Carthage's history as fascinating as I did while researching it. If you enjoyed the documentary, a like and a subscribe would mean the world to me. It helps the channel grow and keeps these films coming. One last question before you go. Augustine of Hippo asked North African peasants who they were 550 years after Rome destroyed Carthage. They answered, "We are Canaanites." What do you think it takes for a people to remember who they are for that long, even after their language, their books, and their cities are gone? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.